Hey guys, Rhett Thompson here, and today we're talking about the one or maybe two ISO mistakes you are probably making on your GH5. Some of this is going to apply to the GH5S and other cameras too, but especially on the GH5, these are the few things you should definitely be avoiding. Okay, we're editing the video here and there's something we need to talk about. So let's get this straight. We've got two things people confuse all the time on the GH5 and cameras in general, and that is native ISO and base ISO. They are different. So base ISO is the lowest possible ISO you could go, which is either 200 or 100, depending on if you have extended ISO on the GH5. Second is native ISO, which is the ISO that Panasonic says that the camera should perform absolutely the best at, which on the GH5 is 400 ISO. So best performance, that doesn't mean just noise. That means a good amount of noise, a good amount of dynamic range, the really best color that the camera can produce in terms of accuracy or, just the pleasing colors. And so that is the difference. Base ISO, best noise performance. Native ISO, best overall performance. Anyway, let's get back to the video. So the biggest thing you really need to avoid when shooting on the GH5 is extended ISO turned on and that ISO set to 100. Now I know people are going to say this is the best noise performance, you're going to get the cleanest images, and that might be true, but it comes with a huge drawback that I think is not worth it for anybody, and that is, just look at these highlights. But what happens with ISO 100 is essentially it takes an ISO 200 image and just artificially crushes it down. You're not actually, the only reason it seems cleaner is because the shadows have been crushed a little bit more, hiding that noise in the more contrasty profiles. And the result is it can't crush down, pure white. And so that transition from pure white down to 95% white, 90% white, usually in the sky here, like in this clip, just looks awful. If you go up to just 200 ISO, you see, almost an identical image with just kind of better highlight roll off. It's not great, it's not an Alexa, but it's not like Canon EOS R bad with like highlights clipping all over the place. So yeah, you can see here as we increase the ISO just from 100 to 200, a lot of that highlight roll off information comes back right away. And as you increase the ISO to 400 or 800 and above, you actually get better and better highlight roll off the higher your ISO goes, pretty much without end, I think the best highlight performance really might be at about 1600 or 3200 ISO, which is something you would usually stay away from and something you would never use in an outdoor daylight situation. But hey, the footage does not lie. So now that we know not to use ISO 100 just because of those horrible, horrible highlights and the very limited benefit you get, just stop down your lens, increase your shutter speed, literally put an ND on. Literally anything you could do would be better than leaving that ISO at 100. I think this is like one of the very few settings in the GH5 that I would just absolutely not use under almost any circumstance for this reason alone. And so now we're going to go over a little lesson on how traditional ISO works. If you get the GH5S, this isn't going to exactly apply to you because at a certain point your sensor is going to go from one gain switch to another gain switch. But on the GH5 and most cameras out there, they've got a single gain ISO sensor. So what does this mean? So basically, if you guys have ever had a stereo system or a radio, and when you turn it up, you start getting that noise in the background, or if when you're editing audio and it's really quiet and you boost those levels, you get that noise in the background. Well, that's basically what noise is on a camera sensor as well. You've got your base ISO, which is the lowest your camera can go on the GH5, that is 200. And any increment up from there is just digitally boosting that signal instead of actually making the image brighter. And so the further away you get from 200, the worse your noise performance is going to be relatively. At least that's what they want you to think. You may have noticed looking at some of the footage from earlier is that, this scene, properly exposed, adjusted with a shutter speed, doesn't really show that ISO being that different. In fact, if you look at any part of this image, it's actually really difficult to tell the difference between ISO 200 and ISO 6400 when shot at the same exposure. The things that people don't mention though is that noise is not the end all be all. There's dynamic range, there's color. You know, at the very low ISOs, you're going to get better relatively color and dynamic range performance. And the high ISOs, like, you know, over 6400 or even over 3200 for the GH5, is where you're going to start seeing colors that weren't there before, and also some softness being introduced to the image, which isn't going to look really good either. And so this obsession over low noise footage kind of needs to end, because there are way more important things to an image than just your noise levels. Another thing people don't seem to know is how ISO works in relationship to your dynamic range. So for example, we already looked at ISO 100 and how that kind of just throws all your dynamic range away and ruins your sort of highlight roll-off. But the thing no one really ever talks about is that the dynamic range isn't static. You know, it actually shifts as you go through the ISOs. And so here's some counterintuitive sort of thinking here, but for really dark scenes, you know, interiors, lots of shadows, if you have complete control over that situation, it's actually better to use as low of an ISO as possible, because at 200 ISO or at 400 ISO, you're going to get actually more detail in the shadows because of where the noise floor is and other certain elements. And so you're going to get more dynamic range and cleaner shadows at actually low ISOs like 200. Then if you head outdoors, you know, you're doing like a field or a forest or something outside, in that situation where you're going to be dealing with a lot more bright scenes, you're actually going to want to use as high of an ISO as possible. I know it seems totally backwards, because usually outside you can't crank it down low enough, and indoor you need to boost it to, you know, 800 or 1600 just to get a proper exposure. But again, if you had perfect control over the lighting, perfect control over everything, and could adjust these levels, this is how you would want to tackle those situations. So just like ISO 200 is going to give you some really great dynamic range in the shadows, ISO 800, 1600, 3200, or even 6400 might be better for outdoors in a bright scenario, just to get as much detail as possible. These really high ISO clips make me want to point out something else to you guys, which is another huge mistake people make that causes them a lot of frustration with the GH5 or the GH4 before it. And that is people complaining about having noisy images. So sure, because of the small sensor, the GH5 is going to have relatively worse noise performance than a larger sensor camera. I mean, that's not a hard and fast rule, but you know, it's good enough for our discussion. And so despite that, I think you can still get pretty fantastic ISO performance on the GH5, which is a stop better than the GH4 in terms of noise performance. Anyway, the biggest thing people do is they just flat out underexpose their shots. You know, there's a little electronic meter built into your camera, you know, 0 in the middle, there's -3 on the low end, and there's +3 on the high end. And in general, you want that to be between -1 and +1, maybe around 0. Kind of depends on your scene. But if you consistently look at that little meter at the bottom of your screen and see it's at -2, -3, or like maxed out at -3, which means it's even lower, that is going to be why your clips are noisy. If you're going to have a dark scene, expose normally and darken it in post to get that cleanness and that lack of noise. Because when your footage is all shadow, all under, you know, a certain IRE value, there's going to be noise in that footage on any camera. And so it's not really the GH5's fault most of the time. And, you know, looking back at this footage at like 1600, 3200, or even 6400 ISO and above, if you maintain a proper exposure, that noise is, I mean, it's basically not even there. I'm kind of even surprised at how little noise there is in this footage. Don't get me wrong though, I'm not quite in Tony Northrup ISO is fake territory. You see here that ISO 100, you know, there's noise obviously, but going up to ISO 200 in my opinion doesn't really show any change or much of a change. 400, there's some weird lines going on here, but yep, the noise is increasing slowly. 800 is the same story. 1600 doesn't look too much different than 800, maybe a little bit more noisy and random. 3200, there's a lot more color going on here, kind of strange. 6400, the color's gone, but the noise is increased again. And 12,800 is, of course, the worst you can get. But so at least we know that ISO does, in fact, kind of work how we thought traditionally. And the higher ISO you go, the more noise and other artifacts you're going to get. That being said, it's not the most important thing by far. And guys, this last tip on ISO is one that you won't hear anybody else on YouTube talk about. This is a Rhett Thompson patented technique. And that is, don't care. You know, I mean, you know, I know people are gonna like probably light me up for this, but really, nobody watching your videos is gonna care about noise. Nobody, if you're, you know, I mean, sure, to a degree, that is not true. You know, clients, people, but you know, say you're a wedding videographer. I've been shooting on the GH4 and the GH5, and before that, I shot on, you know, 1 2/3 inch tiny sensor camcorders with like an f2 to 5.6 zoom or something crazy like that. Insanely noisy footage, and no one ever complained about noise. You know, it just isn't a thing people who aren't camera guys notice. And I think prioritizing other parts of your shot, the quality of your light, the dynamic range, the highlight roll-offs, the color, things like that is going to be way more important to the average viewer than how noisy your footage is. I mean, if you look back at certain Hollywood movies or TV shows coming out in the last couple of years, like they're adding film grain in. I know it's different than digital noise, but it's not that different. I mean, and the biggest example for me is like, look at Aziz Ansari's show, Master of None. They shot on a really great low light camera, the Panasonic VariCam, and there's some shots in that show that are insanely noisy, and no one cares. It's still a great show, and that was still, you know, a great effective scene. So at the end of the day, noise can't bother you if you just don't let it. So guys, here I am at the end of the video, bouncing light off of a door in Vlog with a grade, and hopefully it looks okay. But anyway, in summary, don't shoot at ISO 100. Bright scenes, you're gonna want to use a higher ISO. Dark scenes where you want more shadow detail, you're gonna want to use a lower ISO. But no matter what you do, don't underexpose your subject. That is the #1 reason people think the GH5 is noisy, and it drives me a little bit crazy. So anyway guys, if you found this video interesting, if I put this in a different perspective for you, whatever, I would definitely consider liking, subscribing, leaving a comment, doing all that stuff. I would really appreciate it. If you really liked the video, I would love it if you subscribed, because that really helps me out, brings more people to the channel, and it means a whole lot. Anyway guys, thanks for watching. If you subscribed, I will see you in the next video.